All right, diving in today, folks. We're going deep, deep into the 17th century. We're talking about Johannes Klauberg.
Uh-huh.
Now, you might not know the name off the top of your head, but trust me, this guy, he's a big deal, especially if you're into Descartes.
Yeah, he's really pivotal in how Descartes' ideas spread, especially in Germany. A real bridge between philosophical worlds, you could say.
Exactly. Professor, reformed thinker, really took those radical Cartesian ideas and made them, well, make sense to a whole different audience. I mean, even Leibniz, the guy was a genius himself, right? He was super impressed by how clearly Klauberg laid everything out.
It's fascinating. It's like he took Descartes, who could be pretty dense, and distilled it down to its core, made it accessible.
Right, and it's not just Leibniz either. Spinoza had his books, the French Cartesians were paying attention, Klauberg was in the thick of it all, influencing folks like Christian Wolff down the line. So for our listeners, this isn't just a history lesson, it's a chance to see how philosophy happens. Like right in the moment, how someone takes these powerful new ideas and shapes them, spreads them, turns them into, well, a movement, right?
It's a great point. We often think of these philosophical giants as working in isolation, but figures like Klauberg show us the crucial role of networks, communities, the back and forth of ideas. He's not just a conduit, he's actively shaping the landscape.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We're diving into Klauberg's world, his work on logic, metaphysics. Oh, and we can't forget the mind-body problem. Always a fun one, right?
Always a head scratcher.
We know you come to the deep dive with different levels of expertise, so no worries. We'll keep it clear, engaging. We're going for the good stuff without getting lost in jargon, right? We'll see how Klauberg acted as a philosopher through his work, what his goals were, how he dealt with these big new ideas.
Definitely. I think one of the best places to start is his logic. It shows how he blended traditions in a really interesting way.
Okay, logic it is. Where do we begin?
Well, there's his book, Logica Vetus et Nova, came out in 1654. It's essentially a Cartesian logic textbook, in line with that whole emphasis on clarity, avoiding error.
Got it. So like a guide to thinking well, basically.
Precisely. And it's telling that Spinoza, a guy known for, shall we say, thoroughly examining philosophical texts, owned a copy. This wasn't just Klauberg parroting Descartes, though. He really saw himself as weaving together the best of Aristotle and Descartes.
Aristotelico-Cartesiana, right, that's how we described it. Seems kind of contradictory at first, but I think I see where he's going with this.
Exactly. He argued that Descartes wasn't trashing all of Aristotle's logic, not the core tools like syllogisms, which are just ways to figure out if conclusions follow from premises. Descartes was more concerned with, how logic was being taught or maybe misused.
Ah, so less about the tools themselves, more about how they were being, I don't know, wielded, like maybe getting bogged down in pointless debates instead of getting at the truth.
Exactly. And Klauberg's point was that those Aristotelian tools, analyzing terms, propositions, all that, they're still valuable. But Descartes added this crucial layer. You need clear, distinct ideas to work with in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. So Klauberg's like, look, let's use the best of both worlds. Let's have our clear and distinct ideas thanks to Descartes, and then let's analyze them rigorously, just like Aristotle taught us.
Right. He saw logic as a way to actually improve thinking. He even called it medicine of the mind. It's about getting rid of errors, doubts, anything that clouds your judgment.
Medicine of the mind. I like that. But how do you use reason to correct faulty reason? It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, isn't it?
He had a clever answer for that. He distinguished between two types of logic. One, natural logic. This is our innate ability to judge. Reason is just part of being human. The other, artificial logic. That's the stuff we learn. The formal rules, the syllogisms, all that.
Okay, so we all have the raw potential, the natural logic, and then through study, we refine it, make it sharper with artificial logic.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of art perfecting nature. We're building on what's already there, honing our natural reasoning skills through training and practice.
So where did Klauberg take all of this? How did this view of logic play out in his work?
Well, his Logica is divided into 4 parts. And it's interesting. The first 2 focus on the individual, how to form your thoughts correctly, and then how to explain them to others.
Ah, so it's practical, almost like a self-help guide for thinkers.
It is. He was really invested in improving education, getting people to think clearly and communicate effectively. He wasn't just an armchair philosopher. He wanted to see real-world results.
And those first 2 parts, they really show that blend of Descartes and Aristotle, right? Like, step 1, get your mind right. Get those clear and distinct ideas. Step 2, make sure you can articulate those ideas. Share that clarity with others.
You got it. And then The last two parts, they shift the focus outward. It's not just about your own thinking anymore. It's about understanding other people's thoughts. This is where his work on hermeneutics comes in.
Hermeneutics, that's the art of interpretation, right?
Precisely. And Clauberg dedicated a whole section of his Logica to the search for the true meaning of the obscure phrase. He argued that words are not just arbitrary symbols, they're effects of the author's thoughts.
Okay, so there's a causal link there, right? The author's thought leads to the words on the page.
Yes. And like any effect, the meaning of those words is influenced by all sorts of factors. The context, the author's style, their intended audience. To really grasp a text, especially in philosophy or theology, you have to reconstruct the author's mindset, their intentions.
Sounds like you need to become a mind reader.
In a way, yes. That's why he emphasized this principle of charity in interpretation. When you're faced with different ways to understand a text, choose the one that doesn't make the author look foolish or, deliberately deceptive.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about being intellectually rigorous. It's also about giving the author the benefit of the doubt, being fair, charitable, I guess.
Exactly. And this wasn't just an abstract principle for Clauberg. He was living through some pretty heated religious debates, what he called the perverse century. And he saw this hermeneutical approach as a way to cut through the noise, to figure out what text really meant.
Ah, so a tool to combat those bad faith interpretations, the deliberate misrepresentations that were so common in those theological battles. He's bringing philosophical tools to bear on a very real, very heated social problem.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember the backdrop of the Fakultätenstreit happening in German universities. This was a power struggle, basically, between different academic faculties, especially philosophy and theology, over who had authority over what.
Turf wars, huh? Happens everywhere.
Right. And by placing hermeneutics within logic, Clauberg was saying, look, these philosophical principles, they apply everywhere, not just within philosophy itself. Theology, law, medicine, anything involving texts and arguments, they all need this kind of rigorous, charitable interpretation. It shows his expansive view of philosophy's role in shaping intellectual life.
Okay, that's a great overview of Clauberg's logic. But now let's move on to something even more fundamental. Let's talk about being itself, ontology. I mean, what is there? What exists? These are big questions.
Huge questions. And while Clauberg didn't invent the term ontology, he really shaped its meaning, especially for German philosophy. You can see his fingerprints on Wolff's work later, and even Kant was wrestling with those concepts.
Oh, he's laying the groundwork for some major philosophical developments.
Absolutely. And one thing that's consistently interesting about Clauberg is how he separates ontology, the study of being in general, from natural theology, the study of God through reason and nature.
Why is that separation so important for him?
Well, it's partly due to his Cartesian leanings. He wants a philosophy that's grounded in reason, clear and distinct ideas, not tied too closely to specific theological interpretations.
So giving philosophy some breathing room, making it its own thing.
Exactly. He wants to establish its autonomy, to show that it can tackle these fundamental questions without relying on religious dogma.
And this separation, this evolving idea of being, you see it reflected in his own writing, right? Like, he keeps refining his understanding over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His major work on ontology went through several editions, and you can trace this development. He starts with a lot of Aristotelian influence. And then, as his engagement with Descartes deepens, it shifts. The role of the thinking self, that I think, therefore I am idea, becomes much more central.
So tell me, how did Clauberg define being? I mean, where do you even start with such a massive concept?
Well, he actually distinguishes between three different senses of being. First, the broadest one, he calls it esse objectivum. Anything you can think about, anything you can say something about that's got this kind of being.
Even things that don't exist, like unicorns or, I don't know, a square circle.
Exactly. Even non-being has being in this sense. He calls it a being of reason because, your mind can grasp it even if it doesn't actually exist out there in the world.
Okay, so our minds can consider all sorts of things, whether they're real or not. That's a pretty wide net for being.
It is, but then he narrows it down. The second sense is esse reale, or esse positivum. This is what can be conceived to exist in reality.
Ah, so now we're talking about things that could actually be real, not just things we can imagine.
Exactly. And here's where the principle of non-contradiction comes in. To have this kind of being, your concept can't contain a logical contradiction, like a square circle. That just doesn't make sense, so it doesn't have SRL.
Right. You can't have something that both is and isn't a square at the same time.
Hmm.
So the second sense of being relies on logic, on our ability to reason about what's possible.
Exactly. And Klauberg even argued that this kind of being, SRL, it already presupposes a thinking mind. It's the mind that recognizes the absence of contradiction and therefore the possibility of something existing.
Okay, so our minds are playing a bigger and bigger role here, but what about actual concrete stuff? Trees, rocks, people, all that.
That's where his third sense of being comes in. Res, or ens rail. This is real being in the sense of substances.
Substances.
These are the fundamental things, the building blocks of reality.
Right.
They exist on their own. They don't depend on anything else for their being.
Got it. So, like, a tree is a substance. It just exists. It's not a property of something else.
Exactly. And then to describe how those substances exist, how they're modified or characterized, he uses the term modes.
Modes, like different ways of being.
Precisely. And he distinguishes between accidental modes, those are things that can change without the substance itself changing, and essential attributes. Those are things that are fundamental to the substance's nature.
So, like, the color of a tree, that's an accidental mode. It can change without the tree ceasing to be a tree. But its treeness, whatever makes it a tree and not a rock, that's an essential attribute.
You got it. In following Descartes, he considered these essential attributes to be modes of thinking, meaning they're the ways in which we conceive of the substance's essence. And then there's this hierarchy of dependence, right? Modes depend on attributes, and attributes depend on the substance itself.
Okay, so it's like a layered cake. You have the substance at the bottom, then the attributes, then the modes on top.
A delicious philosophical cake. And it's interesting, Klauberg's list of attributes, it's a mix of traditional and Cartesian ideas. He's got Descartes' common attributes like existence, duration, and unity, but he also includes those classic transcendentalia like unity, truth, and goodness.
It's like he's trying to find that sweet spot between old and new, bringing those different traditions into conversation.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of a primary attribute for each type of substance. For bodies, it's extension, the fact that they take up space. For minds, it's intellect and will, the capacities for thinking and choosing.
So this primary attribute is like the key to understanding what a substance truly is.
Exactly. It's what makes its nature most clear and distinct to our minds. And this idea of a primary attribute feeds into his understanding of essence.
Essence, that's what makes a thing what it is, right?
Right. And for Klauberg, that what it isness is rooted in those primary attributes. He rejects the Aristotelian idea of hylomorphism, the whole matter and form thing.
So no more forms shaking matter from within. It's all about those primary attributes and how they're conceived by the mind.
Precisely. And this brings us back to that close connection between conceivability and possibility. If you can conceive of something clearly and distinctly without any logical contradiction, then it's possible, at least for God to create.
So possibility becomes tied to the limits of logic, to what our minds can coherently grasp.
Exactly. And this is where we see that blurry line between logic and ontology that our source mentioned. Kleberg wants to say that ontology deals with real being, while logic deals with the rules of thought. But when he defines possibility in terms of logical coherence, those two realms start to overlap.
Right. It's like logic is setting the boundaries for what kinds of things can even be considered in ontology. And this connection, it didn't go unnoticed, right?
Oh no, Kant had a lot to say about this later on. He really scrutinized this close relationship between logic and ontology in Klauberg's work. So you see, Klauberg's ideas, they weren't just sitting in a vacuum. They were sparking debate, pushing philosophical inquiry forward.
Okay, so we've talked about the building blocks of reality, but how do they actually, behave? How does Klauberg explain the natural world?
That's where his Physica comes in, published in 1664. And this is fascinating because he's basically trying to explain Descartes' physics, but using some of the language and concepts of Aristotelian natural philosophy.
It's like he's translating Descartes for an audience steeped in Aristotle, trying to bridge that gap.
Exactly. It's similar to how earlier thinkers tried to update Aristotle with new scientific discoveries. And in his Physica, he really focuses on two things: the nature of corporeal substance, so basically what matter is, and the role of the laws of nature as causes.
Okay, let's unpack that. First, what is matter for Klauberg?
He's a Cartesian at heart, so for him, the essence of matter is res extensa, extension. It's all about taking up space.
So just pure spatiality, no underlying stuff or hidden qualities.
Exactly. But then he has to explain how individual bodies fit into this picture. He introduces this distinction between primary matter, which is just pure, undifferentiated extension, and secondary matter, which is extension that's been shaped, configured into specific forms.
So primary matter is like the raw material, and secondary matter is what we actually see and interact with.
Exactly. And here's a radical idea. Kloberg says that the entire material universe is actually just one gigantic substance, one huge chunk of extension that's just arranged and modified in all these different ways.
Whoa, so there's only one thing in the material world is just taking on all these different forms.
Precisely. And this leads him to reject those Aristotelian substantial forms, those internal principles that supposedly give matter its specific qualities and behaviors. He's saying, no, we don't need those. The laws of nature can explain how matter behaves.
Okay, so the laws of nature are stepping in to explain the diversity and change we see in the physical world. But what does that mean, laws of nature as causes? That sounds a bit odd, right? Like, a law isn't a thing, it's a description of how things behave.
Right. It's a tricky concept. Even Descartes called these laws secondary and particular causes, which raises a lot of questions.
So how does Clauberg deal with this problem?
Well, he starts by distinguishing between God as the ultimate primary cause of everything and secondary causes, which are, the created things that seem to bring about specific effects.
Okay, God's the big mover, the ultimate source of everything, and then there are these secondary causes operating within that framework.
Exactly. But then he gets even more subtle. He says there are two senses of cause. One is a substance, a thing that actively does something, makes something happen. The other is a rule or law, according to which things happen.
Okay, so sometimes cause refers to an agent, and sometimes it refers to a principle or a pattern.
Precisely. And this is where some scholars start to see hints of occasionalism in Clauberg's thinking. If God's the primary cause, the ultimate source of all action, and laws are just the rules he sets up, then maybe created things don't have any real causal power of their own.
Right, maybe they're just following the script that God wrote, so to speak. They're not really doing anything. They're just, I don't know, playing their part.
That's the occasionalist interpretation. But Klober also talks about bodies having a power of moving and things acting as necessary causes in accordance with God's laws. It's like he wants to have it both ways. God's in control, but things still have some kind of agency.
Right, it's a delicate balancing act. He's trying to reconcile those two perspectives, divine sovereignty and the apparent causal power of created things. And all of this gets even more complicated when we talk about the mind and the body.
Oh, absolutely. And his treatise on the mind-body problem, it's called Corporis et Animae in Homine Conjunctio. It's one of the first in-depth discussions of this problem from a Cartesian perspective. And it's here that those occasionalist interpretations really come to the forefront.
Why is that? What does he say that leads people to that conclusion?
Well, he flat out denies any natural unity or causal interaction between the mind and the body. He says they're fundamentally different substances. Mind is pure thought, body is pure extension, so there's no way for them to directly influence each other.
Right. How can something that's purely mental, like a thought, cause something that's purely physical, like a muscle contraction?
Exactly. And he uses these specific terms to describe their relationship, words like occasio and causa procatardica.
Hold on, break those down for me. What do those mean?
Occasio, that's just occasion in Latin. It's like saying something provides the opportunity or the trigger for something else to happen, but it doesn't actually cause it in a direct way. And causa procatardica, that's a bit more technical, but it basically means a triggering cause, something that sets off a chain of events, but isn't itself the direct, efficient cause of the final result.
Okay, so it's like dominoes.
Yeah.
One domino falling might trigger the next one to fall, but it's not forcing it to fall. There's this whole chain of events at play.
Exactly. And this way of talking about the mind-body relationship, it really leans towards occasionalism. It's like Kloberg saying, sure, maybe my decision to raise my arm coincides with my arm actually going up, but it's not my mind directly causing my arm to move. Instead, it's God orchestrating everything behind the scenes, making sure my mind and body are always in sync, even though they can't directly interact.
So it's this pre-established harmony. God's making sure the mental and physical realms line up perfectly. But our source did mention that not everyone agrees with this strict occasionalist interpretation of Clauberg.
Right. Some scholars point out that while he denies direct interaction, he doesn't explicitly say that created things have no causal power whatsoever. He doesn't fully embrace the idea that God is the only true agent in the universe.
So maybe there's some wiggle room, some way to understand Clauberg as saying that created things do have some kind of causal efficacy, even if it's not a direct, efficient causation between mind and body.
That's what some scholars argue. They propose alternative interpretations like interactionism or parallelism. Interactionists suggest that maybe there's some kind of indirect causal link between mind and body, some dependence or correlation that doesn't involve direct influence but still acknowledges a real connection.
Okay, so maybe it's not like flipping a switch, but there's still some kind of interplay, some way they influence each other indirectly.
Exactly. And then you have the parallelists, who argue that for Kloberg, mind and body are like two synchronized clocks running in perfect harmony because God set them up that way, but not actually affecting each other.
Okay, so lots of different ways to interpret Clauberg's take on the mind-body problem. But what was his own preferred term for this relationship?
He called it conjunction. He explicitly says it's not about one thing causing another, it's about this mutual reference, this coordination between mind and body.
Conjunction, so like a joining together, but not necessarily a merging into one thing.
Exactly. They're connected, they relate to each other, but they maintain their distinct natures. He even defines homo, the human being, as simply a composite of a mind and a body joined together in this way.
Okay, so we're not talking about some kind of hybrid mind-body substance. It's more like a partnership, a coordinated effort.
Precisely. He uses analogies like teaching, a federation of states, even friendship, to illustrate this idea of a contingent cooperation, not an essential unity. So for our listeners, this is a key takeaway. Klauber is not trying to reduce the mind-body relationship to simple causation. He's emphasizing this more complex idea of conjunction.
I like that. It's acknowledging the mystery, the complexity of how these two seemingly different things work together. But how does he explain specific phenomena like sensations? How do we go from a physical event like stubbing your toe to a mental experience like feeling pain?
This is where things get even more interesting. He says that the correlation between those mental and physical states, it's ultimately established by God's will. We can't explain it based on pure reason or observation of nature. There's no inherent logical connection between a specific brain state and a specific feeling.
So we can't just look at the brain and say, that pattern of neurons firing, that means the person is feeling pain. There's something more going on, something beyond our ability to fully explain.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he uses this great analogy comparing sensations to those material or instrumental signs. He gives the example of ivy hanging outside a tavern, signaling that wine is available inside.
Okay, so the ivy doesn't inherently represent wine. It's just a convention, a way of communicating that's been established over time.
Precisely. And he says sensations are similar. Pain doesn't naturally represent tissue damage. It's just a sign that God has set up to indicate that something's wrong with the body. So, for Klauberg, understanding the mind-body union is less about finding causal mechanisms and more about recognizing these divinely ordained correlations, these signs that point beyond themselves.
It's a humbling perspective, right? It's acknowledging the limits of our understanding, the role of something beyond the purely material. And with that, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, explored the multifaceted world of Johannes Klauberg. It's clear that he was a major player in 17th century philosophy, not just a follower of Descartes, but a thinker with his own unique contributions.
Absolutely. He tackled huge questions, from the foundations of logic and interpretation to the nature of being itself and the mind-body problem, always striving for clarity and synthesis. He really embodies that dynamic spirit of philosophical inquiry, a constant process of debating, integrating, applying new ideas to old problems.
And what strikes me is how relevant his approach feels today. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with information, different viewpoints, conflicting claims. How do we navigate that? How do we find clarity amidst all the noise?
It's a great question, and maybe Klauberg can offer some guidance. His emphasis on clear and distinct ideas, on charitable interpretation, on bridging different traditions, those are all tools that can help us make sense of this complex world.
Tools for thinking well, for communicating effectively, for understanding each other, even when we disagree. Those are skills that never go out of style. So for our listeners out there, think about Klauberg's legacy. How can his approach to philosophy inform the way you engage with the world, with ideas, with each other? It's a challenge worth considering.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.